Hello, everybody, fans of RTV. Today I'm so excited because with me there is Lars Chittka, Professor of Sensory and Behavioral Ecology at Queen Mary University of London, co-editor of Cognitive Ecology of Pollination. Thank you very much, Lars, to accept our invitation and to be here with us.
You're very welcome. It's nice to meet you, and I look forward to talking to you.
Amazing. So the reason why I asked you this interview is because of your amazing book, The Mind of a Bee, that is here with me. Is a fantastic book that talks about a beautiful research journey about the intelligence and it be cognitive abilities, but we will talk more, of course, because this interview is for that.
Mm-hmm.
And before starting, I would love to just know from you why bees. So why did you choose bees, and how did you approach the research in this field and what actually was the click that caused and let you study or make your research in this space.
I presume you want an honest answer. So, it was a complete accident. So I was an undergraduate student at the University of Göttingen in the 1980s, and that's a small town in Germany, and I very quickly got bored with it. So I thought about moving to Berlin. West Berlin at the time was an island in the middle of East Germany. So I asked a professor in Göttingen what he thought about this idea to change to the Free University of Berlin. And he basically said, well, that's career suicide. That's a terrible university. And all they do is plan revolutions, and don't go there. And then he then he sort of paused from and said, I think there's one good lab and they're working on bees. So I decided, okay, one lab is fine for me, so I'm off to Berlin. Bye-bye. And he was right. The lab where they did work on bees in Berlin was very good and very inspiring. So I went straight there and did some undergraduate practicals. Then I got addicted right away. So
so everything started like that per chance. Amazing. So now we can go into more detail about your book that I'm still reading. I'm at in the section of the behavioral ecology, so be learning about I'm reading about the bee personalities and emotions. So I'm arrived at that part of the book. But I went through the other chapters of the book that each chapter is a word, is a word itself, opens up a real word, starting, for example, from the uh, bee color perception that absolutely fascinated me. And there is in particular a section in your book that I found really fascinating. And you wrote that for some reasons the bees and possible other animals painted the world as we can see now. And that sentence made me really, it was, touching my heart. And then I realized that was yes, true. It's not the opposite, but I would like to hear from you that you also made incredible discoveries about the visual perception. And yeah, I would love to hear from you this perspective. Can you tell us more about how the how bees actually painted our world?
Yes, so of course, before the advent of flowers, the terrestrial environment was largely green or brown or gray, depending on whether it's rocks or vegetation. But there would have been very little in terms of truly colorful objects, unless you would dig up some mineral crystals and so on. And of course, because plants can't move and thus they can't find mating partners by themselves, they eventually resorted to this trick of employing insects, pollinators, that would visit the flowers and carry the pollen in a directed manner from plant to plant, which is way superior to the method of using simply the wind to carry the pollen. And of course, once that trick was invented, hundreds of millions of years ago, plants found ways to generate signals to these pollinators. So they made flowers, so to speak, and these obviously to be highly visible advertising billboards, so to speak, were colored. And so suddenly, in addition to all the plants being just green, you had yellow and blue and white and pink dots in the environment, which were all signals addressing insect visual systems. And of course, because these color vision systems are very different from ours, we, I guess, often think that what we see is the physical reality of our environment. But of course, other animals see colors very differently and with very different sense organs. And so one key difference there between us and insects, including the bees, is that they, but not we, can see ultraviolet light. So they can see the kind of light that gives us sunburn, but we can't detect it. And these insects have specialized receptors. And using these receptors, they can actually see patterns in flowers that are entirely invisible to us. And so the way in which, in this sense, bees painted the world and made flowers colorful is a different one to what we would expect if these colors were addressed to us humans.
Definitely, definitely. So it's really wonderful. And also, I was fascinated by all the so basically, you created the story behind also the big scientists from the 20th century that actually open up new research field, for example, in big color vision and even in big communication, like for example, waggle dance. And so, yeah, there was a very also the context you created behind in which you described not just the research but also the kind of the human being of those scientists. I really loved that, and I wonder if meanwhile you were digging into this storytelling, and so maybe you discover something that you weren't aware of, and you would like to share with us about those scientists, not just as scientists but also as human beings.
Yes, so this was a very interesting journey for me. So I had the luxury to have a sabbatical and at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin, and they had a fantastic library service. So we could dig as far back as anyone could dream. And And there were some very interesting discoveries in the historic literature that were really eye-opening. We often, I guess, think that we're at the forefront of science with present-day discoveries, but it's often a very humbling experience to discover that similar thoughts have already been described by people a century or even 2 centuries ago. And of course, they didn't have the experimental tools that we have nowadays, but many of the thought processes went in similar directions. So to give you a few examples, I was very fascinated by the writings of a Swiss naturalist called François Hubert, who was the first, I guess, to take a look inside a beehive by inserting glass screens into the ceiling or the sidewalls and to discover the inner workings of a bee colony. And upon further exploration, it turned out that the man was actually blind and worked jointly with his wife and a servant. I guess that's what happened in those days. People had servants. But of course, given that the person who actually signed responsible for the works was blind, it actually means that much of the work must have been done by the servant and the wife. I don't know what ideas François Hubert himself produced, but in any case, the team of 3 produced really remarkable insights on the organization of work in a bee colony. So, for example, they wondered how this elaborate labor division comes about, that some bees engage in pollen foraging and others in nectar foraging and others in climate control. And he hypothesized that different individual bees had different sensory thresholds to carbon dioxide. So that the more carbon dioxide there was in the colony, that of course means that there's poor ventilation. So the more individuals started fanning, and then there's a feedback loop by which the carbon dioxide is lowered, and then some of them stop again. But so this idea that sensory thresholds could contribute to division of labor was something that was then formally explored only since the last decade of the previous century. So almost 200 years later. But the idea was all there. And
and
another,
it's incredible. That's incredible it is.
And another new hero for me that I only discovered through this back research is an African-American scientist by the name of Charles Turner, who was born in the middle of the 19th century and lived until the early 20th century. And he is a remarkable case because of his ethnicity, it was hard for him to find permanent employment at a research active university. And so he did much of his work while being a high school teacher at a special school for Black children. And from this background, you have to imagine no access to a library, no
discrimination, of course.
He published over 70 articles about the cognition of insects and other animals, many of them very visionary and forward-looking in terms of the attribution of intelligence to animals. And he also explored individual differences in depth in a variety of invertebrate species. And again, this was something that only became fashionable over a century later when people suddenly discovered the idea of animal personality, and it became a kind of fashion in the 1990s. But Charles Turner had explored all of this a century before.
That's amazing. That's amazing. But like many other discoveries that they were open in the 20th century, I was so impressed about actually the team that would from Germany, from now I don't remember exactly the lab, but where they come from, but actually they were, a kind of, they passed through the next researcher all this knowledge, and the next researcher open up a new other thing. So it was a discovery subsequent the other one. So it's really impressive.
Yeah.
Uh,
You probably are thinking of Carl von Frisch and his
yes,
students.
Carl von
Yeah,
Frisch, and yes, yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting to observe that in this day and age, when in theory all information is accessible through the internet, but and it used to be even decades ago through libraries and so on, even though it was a bit more hard to find the information. But often I think it's still something special to be directly in that environment and be taught by the people who've been at the forefront of the research on a sort of day-to-day interaction basis. And yeah, I think Carl von Frisch had a fairly amazing school of students who were also very successful in extracting more secrets from the world of bees and other insects.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, about a hot topic, I mean, not hot, but about waggle dance. So I would like to ask you if what still remains a mystery about this incredible way of communication among bees, honeybees. So is there anything that for you at this stage is still still you feel that it's still a mystery, and then of course deserves further investigation about this topic?
Yeah, so I think there are many mysteries still. So just to explain for our audience members who might not be entirely familiar with this symbolic
Yeah,
communication
exactly.
system. So if you do what François Hubert did, for example, and put a glass screen into a beehive and then observe what bees are doing, you'll see some of them running around in a small figure, sort of the shape of a figure 8,
Yeah.
as if they were indeed dancing. They go through these motions again and again and again and again. And it turns out that encoded in this movement pattern is the location of the food source that the bees have discovered. So they can use these movement symbols to tell other bees, go 3 kilometers northeast, for example, or 5 kilometers southwest. And that's a unique system anywhere in the animal kingdom, because they actually use symbols to inform other bees of this destination without the need to guide them there. So what you find, let's say, in some social primate groups, one of them has discovered food, so you can lead, physically take the group to the target. There are also some animals that when they're at a food source, they sort of use vocalization to call others to that target. But the bees' communication system allows them to send other bees to a destination many kilometers away without the need to actually physically coming along with them. And so it's a remarkable communication system that's entirely unique to about a dozen species of honeybees. They're all very related. And so until...
Yeah, you say that still this discovery was even done by von Frisch, right?
Indeed.
The first, actually, he opened up this and made
Yes.
the first
Yeah.
discovery on this.
But you
And
asked
yeah.
the mystery still surrounding it. So it is just a few weeks ago that a new study was published that showed that actually in part, this behavior and reading the dance language has to be learned. And people always thought that this language is in its entirety innate, that bees are born with it, and in line with the general stereotype that insect behavior is largely stereotypic and a matter of innate behavior routines. It turns out actually it's not that simple. So they have to learn at least part of this behavior individually from skilled
individually.
Okay.
And but which is bee actually type in the colony will just the foragers are so the foragers bees or any other bee can learn.
So it is the forager bees that do the dancing and also that do the dance following. But of course, what the authors did in this particular study is basically to just remove the contact to experienced bees. So they had cohorts of naive bees that grew up at the same age altogether. And so they had no role models. And it turned out that such bees will display dances, but they're very sloppy. So their direction and distance indication is imprecise and only gets more precise through the following of other bees' dances. And of course, this brings us, or for me, connects to another big mystery, and that is no one quite knows how the dance language evolved in the first place.
In the first place, because of the origin of the waggle dance. Do you mean in terms of in which parts of the world? For
no,
honeybees?
we know that the dance language must have evolved in tropical Asia because all the relatives of the Western hive bee live in tropical Asia. And so it's very likely that this is the region where it evolved. But because all these species of extant honeybees that still exist have the dance language, and no other bee species of the hundreds of other social bee species has anything similar, it is something of a mystery what the evolutionary steps were from having no dance communication to having this very elaborate system that is now present in all the existing honeybee species. And so that's a mystery, how in the same way perhaps as human language, where did it first originate? And if we take the view that perhaps at least part of this language can be learned, then a wholly new question is, perhaps at the very early roots of the evolution of the dance language, it was not actually hardwired, but was a behavior that was innovated by individuals and subsequently copied by other individuals, and only over time perhaps became more hardwired, so that it's partially innate, but still somewhat learned today. But it's at its evolutionary origins, perhaps it was a learned behavior. And in part, I think this is made more plausible by our recent discoveries that bees can learn all kinds of things by observing each other, even object manipulation techniques, like, well, I might call them tool use, that are not at all present in their innate repertoire at all. And nonetheless, they can learn them by copying each other, and they subsequently, these new behaviors spread through whole colonies.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. And it's also connected to the fact that they have an incredible social learning capabilities, and even the most recent discoveries on bee behavior, social learning, and even having personalities, emotions. is something, yeah, really, really incredible. Can you talk a little bit more about this aspect that maybe with most recent examples and discoveries?
Yeah. So, I mean, it has been known for a long while that bees can learn flower colors and
Yeah,
the locations of their hive and food sources and so on. But when talking with my colleagues who work with primates or corvid birds, they were often
yeah,
a little bit dismissive. And they said, well, yes, of course, bees have to be good at learning colors because that's what they do on an everyday basis when they're visiting flowers. But they said, well, but this is unimpressive because they're pre-programmed to learn this. And they said that what we primate researchers do is we deliberately choose tasks that are not part of the everyday challenges of that animal in its natural habitat. Um, and one of the colleagues at the time was working with parrots, and he was trying to, but failing to get his parrots to engage in a string pulling task. And a string pulling task is where you have to pull on a thread or a rope
yeah.
to retrieve a food item that's otherwise out of reach. And
Mhm.
at the time, I more or less as a joke said, well, but I bet our bees can do that. and everyone laughed and thought, now Lars has gone mad completely. But we thought
But
we'd
at the
actually
end,
yeah, so we actually tried it, and it turned out that bees can learn such a task just fine. So what we did was present bees with some artificial flowers, which are just colored
yeah,
discs under a plexiglass screen, and
yeah,
only a thread was sticking out. And the bees basically had to
uh-huh.
learn to pull on the thread to get to the artificial flower, which
To
contained a
get to
little.
the artificial flower. I see, I
uh,
see.
So, and what we always do if a bee has learned something is we give her a little reward of sugar water, which is the natural reward they also find in flowers. And so not only could the bees learn this, but it turned out that they can also pick it up from each other. So once we have one bee trained to pull a string, and then
Mhm.
we allow other bees to look what's going
Two.
on, other bees will learn it too until
Wow.
the the
So,
skill basically spreads to the
yeah,
entire.
how fast is this process, this learning process? How fast can be?
It depends on the individual. So some bees figure this out very quickly within a few minutes just by themselves. Others need a bit more training or multiple trials of observing skilled individuals, but the skill can spread to all workers in a colony within the space of a few days. So the spread is very rapid once you've got a few individuals that have figured it out. And of course, this kind of problem solving technique, no one would have imagined this possible just 10 years ago.
Wow,
And
that's fantastic. Impressive.
yeah, and so you asked about personality. So
Yeah,
for whatever,
personalities and the emotions.
yeah, so whatever task we're training the bees in, there's clearly appreciable differences between individuals. So if this is a learning task, then very obviously some individuals are very fast at figuring something out. Others require way more trials. And it turns out that to some extent, this learning speed is not just individually variable, but also between colonies. And colonies are, of course, families of genetically related individuals. And there are some colonies that where all the workers are relatively faster, and others where everyone is fairly slow. So
Yes.
there is a genetic component to this trait of learning speed. But there is
Mhm.
also variation with regards to other psychological traits, such as, for example, neophilia or neophobia, the readiness with which bees approach novel objects or reject.
Novel object, approaching novel objects. Okay, yeah.
And of course, every beekeeper will confirm that there are differences in aggression levels between colonies, but also between individuals. So wherever you look closely, there is this kind of individual variation that Charles Turner already looked at a century ago, but his work has been forgotten for all the wrong reasons. So one hope is that through blowing the trumpet for this fantastic scientist today is that more people will read his original work. Yes, so there is
exactly.
In contrast to the view that we had after Turner and before the sort of rejuvenated interest in animal personality in the 90s, the view was that, well, all the variation between individuals, whether they be bees or rats, people thought that's just noise. We just need to average that away and find the overall species picture.
Yeah, that's really impressive, really, really impressive. And I think that about this topic, there would be more attention from the public because, from people now tend to be, I mean, in the last decades, possibly, people are becoming very close to bees, and so bees actually is now a topic that it's quite popular, is well known, and people are becoming even more attracted by bees. And I think this kind of fields, spaces of research are really, really interesting, and will call the attention of people. But how about this? How about solitary bees? Because most of the experiments, of course, are done on honeybees or other social bees like bumblebees. But how much is known about solitary bees? And do you think that would be important to make discoveries in that space, given that the majority of the bees on our planet are solitary bees? So, what is your point of view?
So you raised the question first of the media coverage and the public perception of the need to conserve bees. And you're right that, of course, not all bees are social, yet in the public perception, there is nowadays a sense that it's the commercial domesticated honeybee that's under threat. And that is actually not the case. The honeybee is, at least the Western hive bee, is an animal that in many parts of the world is kept and well looked after by beekeepers and is therefore not under any threat unless it's through poor beekeeping practices. But that's an economic problem for the pollination industry and so on, but it's not an ecological problem. The ecological problem arises for the thousands of wild bee species that are also out there, of which, as you said, many are solitary. And you're quite right. Many of these species are very poorly understood in their biology, while at the same time they're already under threat from industrial agricultural processes, from an overuse of pesticides and habitat destruction, and in many cases diseases that are also spread by human shipping of various species across the globe. And many of these solitary bee species are likely to have very fascinating biologies. There's huge variation in their nesting habits. Some of them nest in abandoned snail houses, others drill holes in wood. All of them are single mothers, so that these are individual females that construct a nest all by themselves and provision it. And in many cases, they are likely to be just as intelligent as the social species. But we don't know this yet because they're understudied. So there's a handful of studies from our team, for example, where we tested their color vision abilities, and they're just as good at recognizing and learning colors as are the social species. We also found that they learn important information about their nesting locations, because when they decide where to nest, they also need to check whether it's safe to nest there, and they do that by looking at whether other nests are parasitized or not. And it turns out that they can not just learn to tell the signs of parasitism, but they can also learn to associate visual symbols with the signs of parasitism, so that if let's say triangles or squares are reliably associated with the hallmarks of parasitism, then they will subsequently either avoid triangles or squares in the vicinity of new nesting locations. So it appears that in many ways these might be just as smart as social species, minus perhaps the specific factors of social intelligence, such as the honeybee dance, which of course is unique to social species. So there's a lot to be explored in the solitary bee species still. And it's all the more important, of course, because many of them are under threat from all the factors that we've mentioned.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lars, for sharing also your vision about bees and the importance of bees for the ecological ecological interaction and conservation. So now I think we are close to the end of our interview, and I would like to just know from you when will be the next date for your for presenting your book, if you have any date for presenting your book. And yeah, because I think our listeners would love to hear if there's any chance to maybe attend to one of your presentations nextly.
Yeah, so there is a big event in June called the Pollinator Power Party. And I don't have my diary right in front, but if you Google Pollinator Power Party, that's an online event with several interesting speeches, and I'm giving one of them. And I think anyone can sign up for free and have a listen.
Oh, that's amazing. So when did you say?
I would have to look up the date.
Okay. So you said in July or June?
It is later in June.
Later in okay. Cool.
Hang on. So it's the 23rd of June, the Pollinator Power Party. I think that's a Friday, and the event on lasts, I think, for several days, but my presentation is on the Friday, the 23rd of June.
Fantastic.
At the Pollinator Power Party.
And, anyone can participate, sign up and participate.
Anyone can sign up for free. Yes.
Wow, that's an amazing news. Look forward to it. So thank you very much, Lars, for this amazing interview. And yeah, it was great to hear about your knowledge, your contents that you share with us. And the writing book experience was really, really fascinating. And yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed very much.
Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, and yeah, I hope to see you again, maybe
All
for
right.
the political power party.
All right. Have a nice evening.
Thanks. Bye. You too.
Bye-bye.